Alright everyone, welcome back to the channel for another update. So, Bitcoin ran into that major area of 90k resistance that we've been talking about on the channel for the past few videos. The daily EMA ribbons, the 50 TMA, and the downtrending line of resistance from the all-time high proved too much, and we have fallen to the downside of this pattern, unfortunately. However, we have now filled the CME gap over on Bitcoin at 84,400, and we are really approaching some very enticing long territory. Now, before we dive too much deeply into this, something that I was probably going to wrap up the video on, but I actually want to kind of start things off on, is the S&P 500 right now is not looking too bad, and it is leading the way for Bitcoin, and we'll dive into the daily and show you that in a second. You can see for the S&P 500 from the all-time high, we've only had a 10.5% correction, and you can see, in recent times, we've done the same move. We've done very similar moves back in early 2024. This is typically the time where you want to be looking at those trend reversals. You want to be looking at areas of support that we could potentially open up on Monday and see where things go from there. So at this moment in time, if you look at the chart over on Bitcoin, Bitcoin's chart is literally emulating the S&P 500 almost perfectly. The S&P 500 is leading the way right now. If we do dive into the daily, you can see very similar to Bitcoin. We had that correction. For Bitcoin, this was 110K. For the S&P 500, it was $6,150. We came down sharply, found an area of support, bounced back up to resistance, and we're now sitting at another area of support. Over on Bitcoin, it looks like this. I haven't drawn in the support on this chart, but the support is coming right now for Bitcoin. We're sitting at the CME gap that we've now filled. I'm going to talk about a trade in just one moment, and you can see we are sitting on a huge cluster of volume support. So I do potentially think this setup is looking quite good right now. And I've also noticed that, a lot of the times when the S&P 500 has these sharp declines, these 10% moves to the downside, you can see a lot of the time recently, it initially fills that with a disgusting wick to the bottom. It pumps up a little bit, and then it comes back down for that second back test. You can see it over here. Some very sharp moves back down, finds support at particular levels, and then almost immediately pumps back up, making a higher low. So this setup that we're seeing right now for the S&P 500, I think this is going to be super important to decipher what the next move for Bitcoin is, because the S&P 500 right now, don't want to be too premature. This is the daily time frame, but we wick to the bottom of this support box, and at least as of right now, we're holding this. Now, in previous videos, we talked about how, this 84,400 region, when the CME gap is going to be filled, is going to be a really enticing long opportunity. The only annoying thing about this is that the CME gap had to be filled on Friday, which is today, and of course the S&P 500 isn't going to be trading over the weekend. So with the S&P 500, the market structure clearly copying the way, or leading the way rather, and Bitcoin is just following. I think if you're looking for a really safe bet on what the next move is, you're going to want to have your eyes on where the S&P 500 closes today on Friday. It's not going to be trading over the weekend. So the next most important step is to see what happens over on Monday when the S&P 500 opens. In my opinion, if we come over to the weekly time frame here and we do manage to close weekly right on this level of support, and it's followed up by a Monday push back up to the upside, forming this higher low really convincingly, I think that's going to be kind of all guns blazing, and the kind of local low in is confirmed for Bitcoin. So that's currently what I'm looking at this moment in time. Now, slightly hesitant to say this, but we mentioned on previous videos over on this channel how if we did manage to come down to the CME gap, that I would be entering a long, and that is the case. I do have a long that has just kind of fired off at 84,400. Now, I have to preface this, I'm starting off with very low leverage to see if this catches the bottom in this instance over here. I think if you're kind of preserving as much capital as you possibly can and you're not looking to take a super big risk, what you really want is to wait until Monday, see what happens with the S&P 500. if the S&P 500 closes at pretty much this level that we're on right now and starts to see that recovery on Monday, that is going to probably mean that the CME gap being filled for Bitcoin was that worst price scenario that we were talking about on this channel. However, if you're looking to slowly dabble and start to position yourself in a long, I do think this is a good area to potentially consider. Now, it's up to you, make your own trades and whatnot. I'm definitely not saying go into a 50x, 100x leverage with lots of capital. I'm really testing the waters here, and I'm going to add to my position or remove from my position depending on what happens on the S&P 500 over on Monday. So that is basically the preface of the video. Unfortunately, the CME gap got filled on a Friday. If the CME gap got filled on, Monday, or if the CME gap got filled on Monday while the S&P 500 was coming down to support and you had kind of a whole week of trading, I think Bitcoin would just kind of follow the recovery for the S&P 500. But we're at a weird position right now where the S&P 500 is sitting very neutral at a position of support, and Bitcoin's going to be left to trade by itself over the weekend. So I don't think anything major is going to happen for Bitcoin over the weekend, which is probably why it's best to not go guns blazing and leverage trade at this moment in time, because we're waiting for the S&P 500's next move. We're waiting to see if we bounce on this support or if we slip through it on Monday. That's really going to be the make or break whether the CME gap was the low over on this Bitcoin chart over here. So that is kind of the whole majority of the update. Once again, really prefacing this that I'm just testing the waters and starting to enter really kind of low leverage 5-10x leverage trades with small amounts of capital, and I will add to them. I will add to the position accordingly, and I'll add to the position accordingly on Monday, depending on how we respond to this level right here, round about 5,600 on the S&P 500. So that's really it. Unfortunately, it's going to be a little bit of a boring weekend. Bitcoin's going to be left to trade by itself with no S&P 500. So that's basically the update. And, once again, there's multiple charts kind of outlining that this is a key area of support for Bitcoin right now. We're sitting at pretty much the last Fibonacci in the sand. We're sitting at that CME gap. We're sitting at a cluster of volume on the lower time frames and also the much higher time frames. So I think this is a good place to definitely bounce from and create a higher low for Bitcoin. And then at that point, I think it's going to be a full send back up to the resistance around 90K. In the much kind of higher time frame pictures, what you want to see for the next couple of weeks or so is you of course want to start to see closes above 90K around that region where all of the resistance is coming in over on these charts. In my opinion, the most important one for me is going to be the 50 TMA over here on the daily time frame, coming in round about 88,300. I would love to see a close above that, because historically that is pretty much one of the best ways to trade Bitcoin, and we've talked about this on the channel before, using Bloomberg terminals to statistically backtest every single moving average, every single trading strategy, and trading based on how we respond to the 50 TMA, whether we're closing above it or below it, longing and shorting accordingly, is the best strategy. So that's really what I'm going to be waiting for. And if we do get above this big cluster of resistance between 88 to 90K for Bitcoin, there's not going to be too much else in our way up until these big clusters of volume around about 97K. Also from the high down to the low, got 618 Fibonacci at 96,500, and then it's going to be smooth sailing until kind of 100 and 110K. So once again, testing the waters, very early days with this trade here, lower leverage, low capital, and waiting to see what happens next for the S&P 500. Solana as well, also sitting at a very crucial level of support. So while I'm not leverage trading this one, and while I mentioned I'm not like super jumping into Bitcoin longs at this moment in time, this is the area where I'm accumulating on spot. $130 for Solana, huge area of support. This chart over here for Solana looks the exact same as the S&P 500, and that looks the exact same as what's happening over on Bitcoin as well. So once again, bit of a boring one. We need to wait until Monday. We need to see what the S&P 500 does and how it responds to this level. If we see a recovery rally on Monday followed by a close above 5,600 over the weekend for the S&P 500, then that's going to be kind of the signal that I'm looking for, that the CME gap over here was the local bottom for Bitcoin. So pretty much sit on your hands, buy a spot if you want to. At this level right now, Bitcoin, Solana, amazing spot opportunities, but we'll need to wait until Monday to see what the S&P 500 does, because that's going to be the leader. So for today, that's all I've got. If you enjoyed the video, smash like, leave a comment. Probably won't be a video over this weekend, or at least if there is, it won't be maybe Bitcoin or Solana, just because we're waiting to see what happens next for the S&P 500. So probably expect the next video on Monday. If you want updates on the charts and whatnot, anything in between videos, then be sure to follow me over on Twitter at 618_cowboy and come and join the Discord. The link to that's always in the description, and you can find it attached to the links on this channel. So going to be a boring one, pretty much sit on your hands. This is a good opportunity to buy a spot. If you want to leverage trade from the CME gap like myself, longing from 84,400, like we said that we would do in the prior videos, it's probably going to want to be on low leverage and low capital, but we'll see what happens on Monday, and I'll keep you up to date on Twitter how we close the weekly time frame for the S&P 500. So see you in the next one. See you on Monday. I'm out. Peace.